The gravity of the situation which confronts the world today necessitates my appearance before a joint session of the Congress.
My fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
If you've read, watched, or were taught anything about the Cold War, it was probably treated as a story that went like this. The United States and the Soviet Union faced off for decades. The world held its breath, and then in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and America won. But I believe the Cold War is not best understood as a story. It's better understood as a machine, a system, a set of incentives, institutions, and habits that kept generating the same kinds of decisions over and over across different presidents, parties, and decades. And here's the part that matters. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the machine did not. The inputs changed, and the outputs shifted. But the machine kept running. So today, I'm going to teach you the Cold War as a system, what it was designed to do, where it failed, why those failures repeated, and how those failures still shape the United States right now, in your taxes, in your politics, your wars, and in how much power the government thinks it needs to keep you safe. We're going to treat this like a lecture with a simple framework. First, I will give you the system, then the major mistakes, and finally the modern consequences. If you stay with me, by the end, you should be able to look at modern headlines and recognize the Cold War logic hiding inside of it. The Cold War machine had 4 core goals. First, to prevent the spread of Soviet influence, to maintain U.S. credibility with allies and adversaries, to keep the American economy and technology base strong enough to outproduce the Soviet system, and to avoid nuclear war while still playing a high-stakes global game of chicken. Those goals created real successes. Containment worked in many places. NATO held, the Soviet economy buckled, and nuclear war was avoided. But those same goals also created predictable mistakes, because the machine optimized for short-term stability under existential fear. It rewarded policies that expanded power quickly and punished policies that reduced power slowly. It promoted secrecy over transparency, permanence over rollback, and optics over truth. Now we go mistake by mistake, and I'm going to label each one as a design flaw, because that's what it is, a system error that kept reproducing itself. So the first design flaw was the permanence trap, the mistake of making temporary emergency measures become permanent infrastructure. In a normal democracy, emergencies create exceptions, then the system returns to its baseline. The Cold War machine made the emergency the baseline. When President Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, the message was open-ended. Support free peoples against subjugation. There was no time limit, no exit condition. That's not a single policy. It's a permanent posture. And once you adopt a permanent posture, you need permanent capabilities, permanent budgets, permanent bases, permanent alliances, permanent intelligence collections, and permanent readiness. And permanence changes incentives. If a program is temporary, the institution running it can plan to shrink. If the program is permanent, it needs to justify its existence every year. That usually means expanding, not contracting. And that is why so many Cold War institutions did not end when the Cold War ended. A system was built for a permanent emergency that does not naturally dismantle itself just because the enemy changes its name. The second major design flaw was the credibility spiral. This originated when credibility became a currency that the US felt it had to spend constantly. During the Cold War, leaders feared that if America lost anywhere, it would trigger a domino effect. That wasn't only about territory, it was about reputation. A credibility-obsessed system that encourages escalation because backing down is framed as fatal. And because credibility is intangible, it's easy to overpay for it. You can always argue that the cost is justified because the alternative is unknown catastrophe. Vietnam is a classic example of this, but the credibility spiral is much bigger than Vietnam. It's why proxy wars kept going after they became morally messy and strategically unclear. The machine treats withdrawal as a signal, not as a choice. The third major design flaw was the secrecy advantage. In the Cold War, secrecy looked efficient. It allowed rapid action without public debate. It protected sources and methods. It prevented panic. It reduced political friction. But secrecy also creates moral hazard. When decisions are hidden, accountability weakens, and the temptation to use power increases. Covert operations became attractive because they were cheaper than wars and quieter than diplomacy. Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954 became templates. Support a coup, install a friendly government, claim stability, and the short-term payoff was control. But the long-term cost we have seen is blowback and distrust. Blowback is what happens when hidden actions produce visible consequences years later. Distrust is what happens when citizens learn that major actions were taken without consent. And a system trained on secrecy doesn't just hide information, it teaches the public that power operates in the dark. The fourth major design flaw was the military-industrial feedback loop. The Cold War machine created a self-reinforcing ecosystem around defense spending. Defense budgets funded factories, research labs, contractors, universities, and local economies. And votes protected budgets. Budgets created more constituencies, and this loop helped the US build extraordinary capability. But it also made spending sticky. Once the feedback loop exists, reductions are framed as job losses, regional decline, or natural vulnerability. One of my favorite quotes about this is, when you build a hammer factory that never closes, more problems start looking like nails. The fifth major design flaw is the nuclear game theory in the real world. The Cold War strategy often treated human survival like a logic puzzle. Deterrence, second strike capability, mutually assured destruction, brinksmanship. These ideas may have helped prevent nuclear war, but they also created an environment where leaders repeatedly approached the edge, assuming rationality would hold. The Cuban Missile Crisis is remembered as a moment where leaders stepped back, but it's also proof that the machine allowed the edge to be reached in the first place. Any system that depends on perfect rationality under stress is fragile, because humans are not perfectly rational. Institutions make mistakes and miscommunication happens. Accidents occur. Even today, a simplified descendant of this logic survives as a slogan: strength prevents conflict. Now, sometimes it does. Sometimes it produces escalation. The machine has trained leaders to believe that projecting power is always safer than tolerating uncertainty. The sixth major design flaw was the habit of proxy wars. To avoid direct superpower conflict, the Cold War exported violence outward instead of fighting each other directly. The US and USSR armed proxies. Client states, militias, insurgencies, coups, counter-coups. This reduced the risk of nuclear exchange, but it spread war across the world and often prolonged conflicts because outside powers had incentives to keep proxies alive. The proxy war logic also makes moral clarity difficult. You end up supporting regimes you would not support under normal ethics because the system frames everything as better than Soviets. And you end up training and arming groups that later become enemies because the machine values short-term alignment more than long-term stability. This leads us into the seventh design flaw: coups, blowback, and the legitimacy collapse. Covert regime change was not just a tactic, it became a pattern. The machine repeatedly chose short-term alignment over long-term legitimacy. Removing a leader is easier than building a stable political career. And when legitimacy collapses, extremism finds space. This created long-term resentment and anti-American sentiment that lasted generations. That legacy still matters because it creates a credibility deficit. When the US claims that humanitarian motives today, many audiences abroad interpret those motives through the Cold War memory of manipulation. The eighth major design flaw was the domestic fear engine. A Cold War system doesn't just fight abroad, it shapes society at home. Fear of infiltration and subversion justified loyalty tests, blacklists, and social suspicion. Accusing someone of disloyalty became a political weapon because fear is persuasive. The result was a culture where dissent could be framed as danger. The result was a culture where dissent could be framed as danger. That habit never fully disappeared. Modern politics still defaults to existential threat language, and each side frames the other as catastrophic. The Cold War taught the nation to treat politics as survival, not disagreement. That mindset makes compromise feel like surrender. The ninth major design flaw was information control as a national habit. During the Cold War, information was treated as a weapon. Propaganda wasn't something only they did. Everyone tried to shape narratives to maintain morale, preserve alliances, and deter adversaries. This trained institutions to believe that controlling information can be as important as controlling territory. The modern consequence of this was the line between persuasion and information warfare becoming blurry. Citizens sensed messaging as strategic, which breeds cynicism. Foreign actors exploit that cynicism, and a society trained to distrust information becomes easier to manipulate. The 10th major design flaw was economic policy through a security lens. The Cold War competition pushed the US to outspend and outproduce the Soviet Union. Over time, national security became a justification for domestic policy decisions. Research, education, industrial investment, trade restrictions, and later, financial systems designed to sustain long-term commitments. This produced real positives, like rapid technological advancement, but it also created a habit. If you want a budget, call it security. Once that habit exists, security spending often escapes normal scrutiny. It becomes politically safer to spend on threats than to spend on boring, slow-moving reforms. This leads us into our 11th design flaw, technology path dependency. The Cold War accelerated technology. Satellites, aerospace, computing, early networking, surveillance tools, but it also meant many technologies were built with national security assumptions baked in: monitoring, control, redundancy, secrecy, and rapid escalation. The modern consequence of this was a lot of today's digital world grew out of defense priorities, and that shapes how data is collected, how networks are designed, and how governments think about information space. A system that is built for security competition naturally leans toward monitoring. The 12th design flaw, and this one is really important, is the expansion of executive power. War in general expands executive authority, and the Cold War wasn't just one war. It was an entire era. That meant expanded executive power became normalized for 5 decades. Decisions about covert action, surveillance, foreign commitments, and military escalation were often concentrated in the executive branch with limited transparency. The modern consequence of this is we now expect the president to function as a constant global crisis manager, and that expectation is Cold War inheritance, and it changes what citizens tolerate from the government. The 13th major design flaw was alliance lock-in and dependency. Alliances like NATO were essential deterrence tools, but they also created lock-in. Once you make a promise, backing away is framed as betrayal, and betrayal is framed as collapse. And over time, allies can become dependent on the guarantee, and the guarantor becomes responsible for disputes it did not start. Alliance lock-in also shapes domestic policies. Leaders learn that changing commitments is politically costly, so they default to maintaining and expanding them, even if underlying reality changes. The modern consequence of this is that the US often carries the cost of global order even when the public is tired of paying, because the machine interprets retreat as reputational suicide. The 14th major design flaw is sanctions and economic warfare as default. The Cold War expanded economic warfare, embargoes, export controls, technology restrictions, and financial pressure. Sometimes this works as signaling, but economic warfare often creates unintended consequences. It can harden regimes by giving them an external enemy to blame. It can push economies into black markets. It can punish civilians while empowering security elites. The modern consequence of this is that sanctions have become a go-to tool because they feel cleaner than war. But they can lock countries into a long-term hostility and create cycles of escalation that look non-military yet behave like conflict. The 15th major design flaw is the arms race distortion. Weapons development became political proof of national strength. Capacity itself became the message. More missiles, more submarines, more bombers, more readiness. But arms races distort priorities. They pull talent and money into defense industries and train governments to think in terms of escalation ladders. The modern consequence of this is that even outside nuclear competition, policymakers often think about rivals through the lens of capability comparisons, not through the lens of mutual interests and stability. That mindset makes de-escalation feel like weakness. The 16th major design flaw is the ends justify the means moral drift. Cold War leaders repeatedly justified supporting dictators, undermining democracies, and tolerating abuses because the alternative was framed as Soviet expansion. This created a moral drift, where actions were judged less by consistent principles and more by alignment. Two costs followed. Abroad, it destroyed credibility. People heard freedom rhetoric and watched cynical behavior. And at home, it created cynicism because citizens sensed a gap between ideals and practice. The modern consequence of this is that moral inconsistency from the Cold War era still damages trust in foreign policy. Even when motives are genuine, our legacy creates suspicion. The 17th major design flaw was the overclassification and accountability erosion. Classification expanded massively during the Cold War. Some secrecy was necessary, but classification became a default. And overclassification protects sources, but it also protects agencies from embarrassment and oversight. It hides mistakes, delays accountability, and makes democratic consent harder. The modern consequence of this is enormous parts of government operating behind classification walls. That makes it difficult for citizens to evaluate policy and encourages the belief that real decisions happen out of sight. The 18th major design flaw was the culture of permanent crisis management. The Cold War trained leaders to think in crisis mode: speed, centralization, decisive action, strong messaging. Crisis management is useful when you have an actual crisis, but it is destructive when it becomes a default. And it's created a political culture that rewards dramatic action and punishes careful deliberation. Leaders have learned that calm explanations are boring, but panic and certainty sell. And that is a Cold War political inheritance. Okay, I'm going to give you a quick rapid timeline so you know where we are. And I'm going to try to keep this short, but you need the timeline to feel the pattern. In the late 1940s, the U.S. reorients from wartime mobilization into a permanent national security architecture. The 1950s, containment becomes a doctrine, covert action becomes normal, and the arms race becomes a measurement of seriousness. Then, the 1960s, proxy wars expand, credibility logic peaks, and nuclear brinksmanship hits its most dangerous moments. Then, in the 1970s, distrust grows, secrecy scandals spread, and the public learns how much was done in the shadows. Then, in the 1980s, escalation returns into new forms, spending surges, and the system doubles down until the Soviet economy breaks. The 1990s and beyond, the rival collapses, but the institutions, habits, and the incentives remain, looking for a new mission. And now let's slow down and add all the missing details, because if you want a retention-heavy lesson, you can't just list the flaws. You have to feel the consequences. On the permanence trap, the core consequence is policy inertia. Once a power exists, it becomes easier to use it than justify not using it. A surveillance authority created to track foreign agents becomes a general tool for security. A base built for one crisis becomes a staging ground for the next. A budget line item becomes a default. Each year, the argument shifts from should we have this to how much should we increase it. And the system drifts towards growth because growth is easier to defend than restraint. Next, onto the credibility spiral. The consequence is that leaders become addicted to posture. The machine trains them to treat reputation as the objective, and that makes policy brittle, because reputation is not measurable. You can't quantify how much credibility you've lost or gained, so the safest political move becomes to escalate or to stay, because leaving is a visible action that opponents can and will label as weakness. And that's why so many Cold War speeches sound like the same speech with different names: strength, resolve, commitments, messages, and warnings. Next, on to the secrecy advantage. The consequence is that secrecy becomes the default solution to political difficulty. If the public might object, classify it. If Congress might debate, keep it covert. If allies might hesitate, keep it quiet. Secrecy is a way to bypass friction, but bypassing friction also bypasses consent, and consent is the fuel of all legitimacy. And that means secrecy is borrowing from the future. It buys you action now and it charges you trust later. On to the military-industrial feedback loop. The consequence is that a large portion of the American economy becomes intertwined with security spending. That has two effects that people don't talk about enough. First, it creates jobs and innovation, which is real. Second, it makes security spending emotionally protected. People don't argue for a program only because it's strategic. They argue because it's payroll, it's local factories, it's research grants, it's family stability. That makes downsizing feel like attacking people, not changing strategy. On to the nuclear game theory. The consequence is psychological. When you spend decades living under the logic of deterrence, you train leaders and citizens to treat worst-case scenarios as imminent. That can be rational, but it also creates a bias. If you can imagine catastrophe, you start designing politics around avoiding catastrophe, even if the probability is low. That bias spreads beyond nukes. It becomes a general worldview. If we show weakness, we die. That worldview is incredibly powerful in politics. On the proxy war habit and the coups and blowback cycle, the consequence is that the Cold War's violence didn't end. It moved. The machine treated other countries as squares where stability meant alignment. But human societies are not chessboards. When you overthrow a government or arm a faction, you are intervening in real social system with historical forces you do not have any control over. And when those forces explode later, officials call it unexpected. But the people you living there usually call, what do you think would happen? On to the domestic fear engine. The consequence is cultural fragmentation. Fear is not just an emotion, it is a governance tool. It turns politics into loyalty tests. It rewards exaggeration. It punishes nuance. It trains people to interpret disagreement as danger. And that is why Cold War rhetoric was so absolute. It was designed to unify through fear. But the long-term cost is that once fear becomes your tool, you need fear to keep unity. And if there is no Soviet Union, you will find a new threat. On to information control. The consequence is that the public becomes information fatigued. In a propaganda environment, people stop trusting narratives. And that cynicism feels sophisticated, but it has a dark side. When you distrust everything, you become vulnerable to the person who tells you what you want to hear. The Cold War helped normalize strategic messaging. Social media turned that into a constant noise war. On to executive power. The consequence is that the center of gravity shifts. Congress debates slowly. Courts move slowly. The executive can act quickly. And under existential threat, speed feels like survival. So power flows to the executive. But power rarely flows back. Decades later, citizens complain about executive overreach, but they also demand immediate action. That is the trap. We built an executive designed for emergency, and then we made emergency permanent. Okay, let me make this personal, because you need to understand what this machine does to you. It's easy to think about this as geopolitics, but the Cold War machine affects how your tax dollars are spent. Because the security state has priority in its budgets. It affects your privacy because surveillance tools built for foreign threats tend to expand towards domestic use over time. It affects your trust in institutions, because secrecy and narrative management train people to assume hidden motives. It affects your political culture, because fear-based framing makes compromise look like surrender. It affects your economy, because security competition shaped research priorities, industrial policy, and even how debt is tolerated when justification is national interest. It even affects your media diet, because the Cold War helped create a worldview where there is always a hidden angle, always a deeper fight behind the surface. So when people ask why modern America feels like it's stuck in permanent conflict mode, this is why. We built a machine for permanent conflict without direct war, and then we got used to living inside it. And now here's the part that people miss. The mistakes weren't just moral, they were structural. A structural mistake is one that keeps happening even when the people change. The US elected different presidents, different parties, different personalities, and the machine still produced secrecy, escalation, permanent budgets, and interventions. That is what a system does. It generates behavior. So if you want to be smarter than the machine, you don't only judge individual chaos. You learn the incentives, because incentives predict the next choice. So now we can go back to the real question. What does it mean today? It means that when a new crisis appears, the machine already has muscle memory. It knows how to increase budgets. It knows how to expand surveillance. The machine knows how to frame dissent as danger. It knows how to treat credibility as objective, and the machine knows how to make the new powers permanent. That is the pattern. And if you can spot the pattern, you can interrupt it. At least with your attention and with your vote, you can try to put this to an end. Now that's everything I promised you. But if you've stayed around this long, I'm going to give you a little bonus. And this is why smart people keep making the same errors. One of the hardest parts of history is that many of the decision makers were not stupid. They were operating with limited information, high stakes, and intense time pressures. So why did the system keep producing the same classes of mistakes? Because the machine rewarded certain behaviors and punished others. If you escalated it and it worked, you look strong. If you escalated and it failed, you could argue that the failure was caused by not escalating enough. And that is a one-way ratchet. If you acted covertly and it worked, you avoided political backlash. But if you acted covertly and it failed, the secrecy delayed accountability and reduced immediate consequences. If you expanded budgets and capabilities, you could always justify it as preparedness. If you tried to cut them, you had to prove a negative, that no crisis would happen later. And if you proposed a restrained, slow, diplomatic approach, you often looked weak in the short term, even if you were right in the long term. And that is what I mean by a structural mistake. The incentives point towards expansion, secrecy, and escalation, so the system keeps drifting in that direction. So when you judge the Cold War, don't only ask what should they have done, ask what would have made the better choice easier to make. Because the question is the bridge to the present. The Cold War is over, but the incentives that were built during its time shape how leaders respond when their fear arrives. So what does this mean today? At this point, you might be thinking, that's a lot of mistakes. And what ties them together? So here's the system level explanation. The Cold War machine optimized for speed, control, and deterrence under existential fear. Under that assumption, you prioritize immediate advantage over long-term legitimacy. But systems built under existential fear tend to persist after that fear fades, because the institutions and incentives they create are self-reinforcing. That is the real story. The Cold War didn't just happen to America, America adapted to it, and adaptations are hard to reverse. So now a fair question to ask is, were these mistakes inevitable? Not entirely. The Soviet threat was real, the nuclear risk was real, but the machine learned to depend on fear to function. And once a system depends on fear, it will always find new threats, because threats justify its existence. And that's not a conspiracy, it's institutional self-preservation. If you take one lesson away from this, I want it to be that history matters because it tells us what systems were built, what incentives were created, and what habits became normal. So every time you hear a modern policy argument, don't just listen to their stated reason. Listen for the machine logic underneath it. Is fear being used to accelerate policy? That is Cold War DNA. Is secrecy being requested with trust us language? That is Cold War DNA. Is credibility being invoked as the goal rather than an outcome? Is temporary measure being turned into permanent infrastructure? Once you recognize those patterns, you are harder to manipulate. The United States won the Cold War, but it also inherited permanent security posture, a permanent credibility obsession, and a permanent suspicion in public life. So the real question isn't did we win? The real question is what did the machine build while we were winning, and can we ever redesign it? Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please check out some of our others and leave a comment below. See you next time on The Hidden Meat.